There is a version of World War I that most people carry inside them without ever questioning it. It lives in the soft blur of sepia photographs, in the dignified geometry of white headstones, in the phrase, "the war to end all wars," which has the rhythm of a conclusion even though nothing concluded. This version of the war is clean. It has a beginning and an end. It has meaning embedded into its grief. It is the version that was constructed while the mud was still wet, while the last men were still dying in hospitals that no longer had beds, while the paperwork of death was still being filed in triplicate in administrative buildings that smelled of carbon paper and damp wool. That version is not what happened. What happened was something far more mechanical, far more patient, far more indifferent to the individual body, the individual mind, the individual name. What happened was a system that learned, over 4 years and 3 months, how to process human beings at industrial scale, and how to describe that processing in language that suggested order, purpose, and sacrifice, when the actual experience, at the level of the flesh, was something that bureaucratic language was specifically designed to conceal. This is the story of what became normal, not what was exceptional, not the atrocities that shocked people at the time, but the practices, the procedures, the accepted standards of a war that ran so long it had time to normalize nearly everything it did to the men trapped inside it. The first thing that became normal was the understanding that you would not be told the truth about where you were going. Men who enlisted in the summer and autumn of 1914 were told the war would be short. They were told this sincerely because the people telling them also believed it. Military planners across Europe had built their entire war strategies on the assumption that modern economies could not sustain a prolonged conflict, that supply chains would collapse, that industrial production could not keep pace with consumption, that armies would exhaust themselves within weeks and be forced to negotiate. These assumptions were wrong in every detail. But by the time they were demonstrably, catastrophically wrong, the machinery of mass recruitment had already been built, the men were already enlisted, and the institutions responsible for telling them the truth had decided, collectively, and without any single order being issued, that the truth was not compatible with the continuation of the war. So from very early in the conflict, men were sent forward without accurate information about what they were entering. They were told objectives were achievable that commanders privately doubted. They were told casualties would be light when preliminary bombardments had already demonstrated they would not be. They were told the enemy wire had been cut when aerial reconnaissance and the reports of forward observers indicated clearly that it had not. This was not always deliberate cruelty. Some of it was institutional optimism. Some of it was the genuine belief, held by officers who had never themselves experienced what they were ordering, that sufficient will could overcome material reality. But the effect was the same regardless of motivation. Men went forward believing one thing. They encountered something entirely different. And the ones who survived came back and were told to prepare to go forward again. This became normal. The gap between official description and physical reality became an accepted feature of the war, so accepted that men stopped expecting correspondence between what they were briefed and what they found. Soldiers developed their own information networks, their own methods of assessing the truth of a situation. They listened to the sounds of enemy artillery and made their own calculations. They watched the faces of the men coming back from a sector before accepting any official assessment of conditions there. They learned to read the language of bodies, because the language of headquarters had become functionally useless as a guide to survival. The trenches themselves became normal. This requires a moment of attention, because the trenches were not a temporary solution that everyone understood would be replaced. They were not a brief interruption to mobile warfare that everyone expected to resume shortly. Within weeks of the war's opening, the lines on the Western Front had stabilized, and within months, both sides had invested so much labor, so much material, and so many dead in the defense of those lines that abandoning them had become unthinkable. Men built permanent structures. They installed drainage where drainage was possible. They laid duck boards over mud that was too deep and too persistent to drain. They constructed dugouts that went down 6, 8, 10, 12 feet into the earth, reinforced with timber and corrugated iron, equipped with bunks and stoves, and in some sectors with electric lighting and even rudimentary plumbing. The normalization of this underground existence was total. Men who had grown up in towns and cities, who had lived in houses with windows and doors that opened onto streets, adjusted to a life where the horizon was defined by the top of a trench wall, where natural light was something you sought carefully and briefly, where the sky above you was a source of danger rather than openness. They developed new habits. They learned which parts of the trench were visible to enemy snipers and which were not. They learned the timings of enemy artillery registration, the hours when shells were most likely to fall on certain coordinates. They learned to sleep in sections, to rest without truly resting, to remain alert to sound even during periods of apparent calm. The body adapted in ways no one had anticipated and no one was tracking systematically. Men's pupils dilated differently. Their hearing became calibrated to distinctions no civilian could perceive. They could identify incoming artillery by sound alone, estimating caliber, trajectory, and likely impact point before the shell arrived. This was not a skill that was formally taught. It was acquired through exposure, through the survival advantage it conferred, through the accumulated experience of being inside an environment that killed you if you failed to pay attention. What was not discussed in official communications was what this adaptation cost. The nervous system that becomes capable of functioning under sustained threat does not simply revert to its previous state when the threat is removed. Men who could sleep in a dugout while shells fell 50 yards away could not sleep in a quiet room for years afterward. Men who had trained themselves to remain emotionally neutral in the presence of death could not reactivate the emotional responses that ordinary life required. The adaptation was real. The cost was real. Neither was acknowledged in the language of official medicine during the war, because acknowledging it would have implied that the environment producing it was inflicting permanent damage on the men it processed, and that was an implication the system was not prepared to absorb. The rats were normal. This is worth stating directly because no account of the trenches can avoid the rats, and every account risks the aesthetic response to them overwhelming the more important fact of their presence, which is what they represented about the material conditions of the war. The rats were large, well-fed, and extraordinarily numerous. They were large and well-fed because the trenches provided them with an unlimited food supply. The food supply was primarily human. Not exclusively, but primarily. The bodies of men who died in no man's land or in collapsed sections of trench could not always be recovered, and in many sectors for extended periods they were not recovered at all. They remained where they had fallen. They decomposed where they had fallen. The rats fed on what the decomposition produced. A rat that has been feeding on a human body for several weeks is physically different from a rat in a city sewer. Men in the trenches could see the difference. They saw it every day. The response to the rats was institutional indifference. They could not be eliminated because their food source could not be eliminated. Poison was ineffective at the scale required, and potentially dangerous to the men it was meant to protect. Traps reduced local populations temporarily, and then populations recovered. The rats were a permanent feature of the environment. Men learned to secure their food, to sleep with their faces covered, to perform a visual check of any dark space before inserting a hand into it. Some men, after extended periods in the line, reported a complete absence of emotional response to the rats. Not disgust suppressed, not fear controlled. An actual absence. The stimulus no longer produced a reaction. This is one of the more precise indicators of what the environment was doing to the nervous systems of the men inside it. The lice were universal. Every man who served in the trenches for any extended period carried lice. This was not a reflection of personal hygiene failures. It was a structural consequence of the conditions. Men could not bathe regularly. They could not change clothing regularly. When they were out of the line, delousing stations existed and men used them, and within days of returning to the trenches they were infested again. The lice produced a constant, low-level physical distress that is difficult to convey to someone who has not experienced it. It was not incapacitating. It was not the kind of thing that appeared in casualty reports or medical assessments. It was simply always present, always demanding a fraction of attention, always adding to the aggregate burden of physical discomfort that the trench environment imposed on every man within it. The official response to the lice was essentially bureaucratic. Delousing procedures were documented. Standards for delousing stations were established. The frequency with which men should be processed through them was specified. None of this addressed the fundamental problem, which was that the conditions producing the infestation could not be changed without ending the war. And the war was not ending. The paperwork surrounding the lice problem was, in a precise sense, the institutional substitute for solving it. Trench foot became normal. This is another item that appears in histories of the war as a curiosity, as a period detail, but whose actual significance is that it represents a predictable, preventable medical condition that the army allowed to occur at mass scale because the logistical cost of preventing it was deemed too high. Trench foot is caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions, specifically by standing in cold water for extended periods. It begins as pain and numbness. It progresses through stages of swelling, blistering, and tissue damage. In severe cases, it results in gangrene and amputation. In all cases, it causes significant suffering and debility. The condition was understood. The cause was understood. The prevention was understood. Men needed dry socks. They needed the opportunity to dry their feet. They needed footwear that was more effective than what they had been issued. These requirements were known in the first winter of the war. They were documented in medical reports. They were communicated up through chains of command. The supplies required to address them were not provided in sufficient quantities for a long time, and in some sectors never provided adequately. The condition became classified as a disciplinary matter in some units, on the theory that men who developed trench foot had failed to take proper care of themselves, which was a way of making the men responsible for a condition that the institution had failed to prevent. This pattern, the reclassification of institutional failure as individual failing, appears throughout the medical history of the war with a consistency that suggests it was not accidental. It was, at some level, a structural feature of an institution that could not afford to acknowledge the scale of the damage its operating conditions were inflicting on the human material it managed. Gas became normal. The first large-scale use of chlorine gas on the Western Front at Ypres in April of 1915 produced a reaction that is accurately described as horror. Men who had never encountered this weapon had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. They saw the yellow-green cloud drifting toward them, and some of them thought it was a smokescreen of some conventional kind. They breathed it in. The chlorine attacked the tissues of the lungs, producing fluid, making breathing an escalating impossibility. Men died in the trenches. Men ran from the trenches and were shot. Men who survived carried the damage in their lungs for years. Within months, both sides were using chemical weapons. Within a year, the variety of agents deployed had expanded significantly. Phosgene was introduced, more lethal than chlorine, and more difficult to detect because it did not produce the immediate burning sensation that chlorine did. Men breathed it without knowing they had breathed it, and then collapsed and died up to 48 hours later. Mustard agent was introduced later and operated differently from the earlier agents. It was not primarily a lethal weapon, but a disabling one. It did not kill quickly. It blistered the skin, the eyes, the respiratory tract. It contaminated clothing and equipment for days. It could lie dormant in shell craters and low ground and activate when disturbed. Men walked through ground that had been shelled with mustard agent and did not know they had been exposed until the blisters began to form hours later. The normalization of chemical warfare is one of the most significant things that happened in this war, because it did not produce the moral crisis that might have been expected. There were formal protests. There was language in various official communications expressing that this form of warfare was contrary to the accepted laws and customs of war. And then both sides continued to use it on an escalating scale because it was effective, because the other side was using it, and because within the logic of industrial war, effectiveness was the primary criterion. By 1917, the use of chemical weapons was so integrated into standard artillery planning that shells of different types were mixed in bombardments as a matter of routine. Calculation, not outrage. Calculation. The gas mask became a standard piece of equipment. Men trained with it. They learned to put it on within seconds of receiving the alarm. They learned to work, fight, and carry casualties while wearing it. They learned that the mask reduced visibility significantly, that it made communication difficult, that it was physically exhausting to breathe through for extended periods, that the rubber deteriorated in cold weather and became less effective, that the seal against the face required constant checking. All of this was in the training manuals. All of this was accepted as the normal operating condition of a soldier in the line. What was not in the training manuals was the accumulation of long-term respiratory damage from exposure to agents at subacute levels. Men who were never identified as gas casualties, who never appeared in the casualty statistics for chemical weapons, who went through the war without a formal gas wound on their record, nevertheless breathed contaminated air for extended periods. The damage this produced was diffuse, gradual, and not attributable to any single incident. It therefore did not appear in the statistics. It appeared, years later, in the bodies of veterans, in rates of respiratory illness, in deaths attributed to other causes, in a general shortening of life that no one was tracking or measuring in a way that would connect it back to what the men had breathed in the trenches. Shell shock was real, and the institutional response to it was one of the most precise illustrations of how the system processed evidence it could not afford to accept. The condition was observed from very early in the war. Men who had been exposed to the concussive force of artillery shells, who had been buried alive when shells detonated nearby, who had survived attacks in which everyone around them died, were presenting with symptoms that did not fit the existing medical categories for physical wounds. They were trembling. They could not speak. They could not walk. They were having seizures. They were blind without anatomical cause. They were deaf without anatomical cause. They were experiencing repeated, involuntary reliving of events, unable to control the intrusion of what they had witnessed into their waking and sleeping consciousness. The initial institutional response was skepticism. The Army's medical system was designed to process physical wounds and return men to service as quickly as possible. It was not designed to accommodate conditions that could not be located in the body and photographed or measured. The early terminology reflected this. Men were described as having disordered action of the heart. They were described as being in a state of nervous exhaustion. The language was carefully chosen to suggest that the condition was transient, manageable, and not implying anything fundamental about the environment that had produced it. Some doctors pushed back. Some wrote reports arguing that what they were seeing was a genuine physiological condition, that the concussive force of artillery shells was producing physical changes in the brain, that the sustained psychological stress of trench conditions was producing something that merited serious medical attention and extended recovery time. These reports were received, filed, and in many cases had no discernible effect on policy, because the war needed men. And the acknowledgement that the war itself was producing a condition that permanently disabled men would have implied a limit on how long men could be exposed to it, which would have implied a limit on what the war could demand, and that was not a limit anyone in authority was prepared to accept. The management of shell shock became its own administrative system. Men who could not be returned to the front were classified according to a hierarchy that was more about administrative convenience than medical reality. Some were classified as genuinely wounded and therefore entitled to pensions and treatment. Others were classified as having not yet diagnosed conditions which kept them in a category where they received minimal treatment and remained in a kind of institutional limbo, neither certified as wounded nor returned to service. Others were classified as cowards or malingerers, which had the effect of removing their condition from the medical record entirely and placing it in the disciplinary record. The difference between these classifications often had very little to do with the severity of the man's condition. It had a great deal to do with which doctor saw him, what that doctor had been told to look for, what the current pressure on manpower was in his sector, and what administrative category was most convenient given the unit's needs. Officers and enlisted men were processed differently. This was not a secret. Officers were more likely to receive diagnoses that acknowledged their condition as genuine and that provided extended treatment in facilities that were, by comparison with what enlisted men received, relatively humane. Enlisted men were more likely to be cycled back to the front after shorter periods, more likely to receive diagnoses that emphasized recovery over treatment, more likely to find themselves back in the conditions that had produced their collapse in the first place. The class structure of British society was intact inside the army, and it was intact inside the medical system, and it produced predictably different outcomes for men who were experiencing substantially the same thing. The men who were shot for cowardice were the extreme end of this system. They were men who had, in the official judgment of courts-martial that rarely lasted more than a few minutes, failed in their duty by refusing to go forward, by running from their positions, by absenting themselves without leave from places where shells fell continuously and men died in large numbers. 306 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed during the war. The number itself is almost beside the point. What matters is that these executions were carried out by the same institution that was sending men forward into conditions that it knew, from its own medical evidence, were producing irreversible psychological damage. The institution's response to that damage, in the cases that ended in execution, was to classify the damage as a character failure, to hold a brief proceeding and to shoot the man in the presence of his unit as an object lesson. The executions were witnessed by other soldiers. This was not incidental. They were meant to be witnessed. The idea was that seeing the consequence of failure would reinforce the behavior the institution required. The effect it actually had on the men who witnessed them is a different matter. Men who watched other men shot by firing squads composed of their own comrades. Men who in some cases were part of those firing squads. Men who were required to attend and observe as a matter of military duty, carried that experience in whatever way they carried all the other experiences the war provided, without acknowledgement, without support, without any institutional language that recognized what had been demanded of them. The rotation system was meant to manage psychological load. It was based on the theory that men could not be kept in the front line indefinitely without breaking, and that regular withdrawal to rear areas would allow them to recover sufficiently to function when returned. The theory was correct in outline. The implementation was catastrophically inconsistent. Units were sometimes kept in forward positions for periods far longer than the official rotation schedule called for. The reasons were always operational. There was always a reason why the rotation could not happen on schedule. There was always an attack being prepared, or a sector that was too active to hand over, or a shortage of reliefs that prevented the planned withdrawal. The official schedule existed. The gap between the schedule and reality existed alongside it, and the gap was never acknowledged officially because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging the disparity between what the system promised and what it delivered. Men who spent extended periods in the line without the promised rotation were not given additional compensation or recognition. They were not formally identified as having been subjected to greater stress than the official schedule anticipated. They returned to the line, and they continued to function until they did not. And when they stopped functioning, they entered whatever administrative category their behavior placed them in, and the system continued. The stench was normal. This requires attention, because the stench of the trenches is not a detail that appears frequently in official accounts, and its absence from official accounts is itself significant. The smell of a trench sector that had been heavily fought over was produced by a combination of sources that included decomposing human and animal bodies, the chemical residue of explosives, the sulfurous output of artillery propellants, the chlorine compounds that lingered in low-lying ground long after a gas attack. human waste from latrines that were inadequate to the number of men using them and often destroyed by shell fire and then not replaced, and the specific smell of mud that has been repeatedly turned over by high explosive. This is not the mud of a field or a construction site. This is mud that contains within it fragments of everything the shells have broken, which includes human beings. Men described adapting to this smell within days of arrival in a new sector, not choosing to ignore it. Adapting. The olfactory system, like the auditory system and the visual system, adjusts its sensitivity to persistent stimuli. Men who came from rear areas back into the line after periods of leave reported that the smell returned to their awareness with full force and then subsided again as adaptation re-established itself. Men who returned home on leave reported that family members reacted to the smell on their clothing and bodies with distress. Men reported not having noticed until that reaction that they carried the smell with them. The smell was inside the adaptation and therefore invisible to the man who carried it. No official account of conditions in any sector included systematic documentation of this. It was not a variable that appeared in the reports that went up through the chain of command. It was not a factor in assessments of sector conditions or in planning for operations. It was simply an aspect of the environment that the men inside it absorbed, and that the institution recording that environment chose not to record. The food was a managed inadequacy. This is the precise description. It was not starvation. It was not, in official terms, below the minimum required for a man to function. In official terms, the caloric provision for a soldier in the British Army during the First World War was sufficient. The official record shows this. What the official record does not show is the consistency gap between the ration as specified and the ration as delivered, particularly in forward areas where supply lines were under shell fire, and where the men responsible for carrying rations forward might themselves become casualties before reaching their destination. It does not show the quality degradation of food transported in the conditions of the front. It does not show the impossibility, in many circumstances, of heating food, which transforms an adequate caloric provision into something that provides the calories without providing the physical and psychological benefit that hot food produces in extreme cold and stress. Men ate cold food in cold mud for extended periods. The cold food was often contaminated with the smells and substances of the environment. Biscuits that were supposed to be hardtack were frequently described as tasting of gas, because the containers they were transported in had been in sectors where gas had been used. Meat that arrived from the field kitchens in metal containers designed to retain heat arrived cold because the distance and the conditions had dissipated the heat. Tea, which was the primary hot beverage and which had genuine physiological value in terms of warmth and the mild stimulant effect of caffeine, was often cold by the time it reached the front line. The men who received it drank it anyway. The organization of supply was genuinely impressive at scale. The ability to move food, ammunition, equipment, and replacement men to millions of men along a front of several hundred miles was a logistical achievement that had not existed before this war, and that required the development of new administrative methods, new transportation infrastructure, and new systems of inventory and distribution. The achievement was real. It existed alongside the consistent, documented failure to deliver adequate conditions to the individual men at the end of the supply chain. Both things were true simultaneously. The system worked. The men inside it were cold, hungry, wet, and louse-infested. These statements are compatible. The system was designed to process men, not to provide them with comfort. Comfort was a secondary consideration to the extent that it appeared in planning at all. Death by friendly fire was normal. This category of casualty was tracked, documented, and persistently underreported, which means the documentation that does exist represents a minimum. Men were killed by their own artillery, which is the most common source of friendly fire casualties in this war, in numbers that the institution acknowledged were significant, but which no single record captures completely, because the attribution of a death to short-falling artillery required someone to observe it and report it and have the report credited. and these conditions were frequently not met simultaneously. Men were killed in the dark by their own sentries. Men were killed by their own grenades, by premature detonation of fuses that were defective or that had been stored in conditions that degraded their reliability. Men were killed by their own aircraft, which in the confused visual environment of a battle, particularly a battle involving smoke and dust and the movement of troops in directions not precisely matching the positions marked on the most recent maps, could not always distinguish friend from enemy. The official language for these deaths varied. Some were recorded as killed in action without specification. Some were recorded in unit diaries with a brief note indicating the circumstances. Some were investigated, particularly when the artillery error was egregious enough to kill a significant number of men and when the officers responsible were senior enough to attract institutional attention. Most were absorbed into the general category of the dead without extensive documentation of what had produced them. For the men who survived watching their companions killed by their own weapons, the experience produced something that is difficult to locate in the official categories of response. It was not grief exactly, though grief was present. It was not anger exactly, though anger was present. It was closer to a confirmation of something that the trench environment had been implying continuously, which was that the distinction between the enemy and the general forces of destruction was not as clear as the official framing of the war required it to be. The shell did not care which side fired it. The gas did not distinguish between the men it was aimed at and the wind that carried it back. The trench mud that filled a man's lungs when a shell detonated nearby and buried him was not the enemy's mud. It was just mud. Burial was a problem that the war produced faster than any institution could manage. The scale of death in major engagements exceeded the capacity of any system that had been designed to deal with death at human scale. At the Somme, on the first day of July 1916, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 dead. These men died across an area of ground that was simultaneously under fire, contested by the enemy, and actively being used for subsequent operations. The dead could not simply be collected and processed. They could not be identified, prepared, and buried according to any procedure that peacetime experience had established. They accumulated on the ground, and in the wire, and in shell craters, and in the ruins of trenches, and they remained there while the operations around them continued. The Graves Registration Commission, which was the body responsible for documenting and, if possible, locating the dead, was doing work that had no precedent and no adequate staffing. Men were recorded as missing, presumed dead. This phrase, which appears on hundreds of thousands of records, is a precise administrative statement of institutional limitation. It doesn't mean the man's death was uncertain in any meaningful sense. It means that the institution could not document it in the form that the institution required documentation to take. The body could not be found, or could not be identified, or was in ground that could not be reached. The institution, therefore, could not issue the specific piece of paper that formal death required. It issued a different piece of paper, one that performed the administrative function of death without the evidentiary basis that the form demanded. The families of men recorded as missing, presumed dead, experienced this administrative imprecision as a particular form of suffering. For years after the war, some of them retained the belief, or the hope, or the inability to relinquish the possibility that the man was not dead, but was somewhere that could not be communicated from. Some of this was reinforced by the fact that some men did survive capture without records being created, that some men did emerge from the chaos of the war with disrupted identities, that the communication systems of the war were imperfect enough that genuine uncertainty about individual fates was possible in some cases. The institution did not, in the period immediately after the war, systematically address the question of what missing, presumed dead meant for the families left with that phrase. The phrase served its administrative purpose. That it failed to serve the human purpose it was nominally performing was a secondary consideration. The Menin Gate at Ypres, which was completed in 1927, contains the names of 54,000 men whose graves are not known. This is the physical form of the administrative phrase. 54,000 names of men whose bodies could not be documented in the required form. The gate is large. Walking through it, reading the names, understanding that each name corresponds to a body that remains somewhere in the ground of that small area of Belgium, somewhere not marked, somewhere not found, somewhere that the subsequent decades of farming and construction and ordinary life have passed over without knowing what they pass over. This is what mass death at industrial scale looks like when it has been processed by the systems designed to manage it. It looks like a very large gate covered in names. Executions of prisoners were not exceptional. The official laws of war, the conventions that both sides had notionally agreed to, specified the treatment of prisoners of war in terms that would have been recognizable to any civilized society. Prisoners were to be treated humanely. They were to be fed and housed adequately. They were not to be subjected to violence beyond what was required to secure their capture. These conventions were observed with significant inconsistency on all sides. The point at which a man ceased to be an enemy combatant and became a prisoner protected by the laws of war was precisely the point of maximum danger in the capture process. Because it was the point at which the captor's adrenaline was highest, the command structure was most disrupted, and the formal protocols that regulated behavior had the least practical force. Men were killed in the process of surrendering. They were killed after surrendering. They were killed as prisoners awaiting transfer to the rear. They were killed in reprisal for the deaths of comrades earlier in the same action. They were killed because the unit responsible for them had no facilities for managing prisoners, and no way of transporting them and killing them was the solution that required the least institutional resource. None of this was formally approved by any authority on any side. All of it was known at some level to the institutional authorities on all sides because it appeared in reports and in the testimony of men who witnessed it, and in the differential between men who were documented as captured and men who arrived at prisoner of war camps. The gap in the numbers was the gap occupied by men who had been captured and then killed, and the gap was large enough on all sides to be statistically visible. The management of this knowledge by institutional authorities followed a consistent pattern. Investigations were opened. Some investigations produced findings. Findings were filed. Prosecutions were rare and were generally of men at the lowest level of the command structure, men who could be identified as having acted outside their orders, men whose prosecution served the institutional purpose of demonstrating that the institution maintained standards without requiring any examination of the conditions that had produced the behavior. The conditions that produced the behavior were standard operating conditions. They were therefore not subject to examination. Propaganda was normal on both sides and was produced, distributed, and maintained by state institutions with a thoroughness that reflected the understanding, arrived at relatively early in the war, that civilian morale was as important a military resource as men and ammunition. The British War Propaganda Bureau, established within days of the war's opening, produced material across every medium available and worked to ensure that material incompatible with its objectives did not reach the public. Newspapers agreed to restrictions on what they could report. Photographers working in the war zone operated under restrictions on what they could photograph and on what the photographs they took could be used for. Letters sent home by soldiers passed through censorship processes that removed content describing conditions in terms that might alarm or discourage civilians. The men who operated these censorship systems were often other soldiers, men who had been injured or who were assigned to rear area duties, men who read through the personal correspondence of their comrades and marked or removed passages according to guidelines they had been given. The guidelines specified military information that could not be transmitted, references to specific locations and unit identifications, references to tactical situations and supply conditions. But they also covered, in practice if not always in explicit policy, the kind of frank description of conditions and casualties that would have given the people receiving the letters an accurate picture of what the front was. Men learned to write within the censorship parameters. They developed codes, sometimes, with people at home who knew what certain phrases meant. They learned to communicate in a compressed language that conveyed what the official language could not contain. The letters that arrived home were a filtered version of the experience. The families who read them were not, in most cases, aware of how thoroughly filtered they were. The photographs that reached the public during the war were primarily images of men advancing, men at rest, men in training, men smiling at the camera in a way that communicated confidence and controlled cheerfulness. The photographs of the actual conditions of trench warfare, of the dead lying in the positions in which they had died, of the physical landscape produced by sustained artillery bombardment, of the medical consequences of gas and shrapnel and infection. These were either not taken because the people who might have taken them were under instructions not to, or not published because the people who might have published them had agreed not to. Some exist in archives. They were taken by men who understood what they were documenting and kept the documentation for reasons that the institution had not anticipated. The official history of what the photography of this war shows is therefore not a history of what the photography of this war actually shows. The photographs in the archives, the ones not published, the ones that arrived at newspapers and were declined or suppressed, are a parallel history. They show what the published record was designed to obscure. Together, the two bodies of photography constitute a precise record of what the institution considered showable and what it considered incompatible with its requirements. The horses. 10 million horses died in the First World War. This number is worth pausing on, not because the animal deaths are equivalent to the human deaths, but because the horses represent something about the war's logistical reality that the language of military operations tends to obscure. The horse was not a relic of pre-industrial warfare that the machine age was in the process of replacing. The horse was the primary motive power of the artillery, which was the primary instrument of the war. Without horses, artillery could not be moved to position, ammunition could not be supplied. The command and logistic systems that the army required to function could not operate. The war that is often described as the beginning of mechanized warfare was, for the majority of its duration, profoundly dependent on animal labor. The horses died from shell wounds and gas exposure and exhaustion and disease, and the mud that could swallow a horse that stumbled on a badly maintained supply track and could not regain its footing before the mud took it. The veterinary services were real and extensive and worked constantly to treat and return horses that could be saved. The horses that could not be saved were shot, and their carcasses were left where they had fallen, unless they were blocking a supply route, in which case they were moved. The decomposition of horse carcasses along supply routes was a constant feature of the landscape of the rear areas, visible, smellable, accepted as a feature of the environment by everyone who worked in it. The suffering of the horses was documented with the same bureaucratic thoroughness as everything else in the war. Veterinary reports, casualty statistics, supply records. The horses that died were replaced by horses requisitioned from farms and businesses in Britain and transported to France and Belgium. The requisition process had its own bureaucracy. Farmers who lost their horses to requisition received compensation at rates set by the government. The rates were contested extensively through formal processes. The bureaucracy of horse compensation ran concurrently with the bureaucracy of human death at the same administrative level, in the same buildings, filed in the same systems. Burial alive was not rare. The artillery of the First World War fired shells in numbers that have been calculated and are known, and the effect of shells detonating in close proximity to men in trenches was, among other things, that the earth displaced by the explosion could fall back on men who were standing or lying nearby and cover them. Men were buried alive regularly enough that units developed procedures for rapid excavation after bombardments, and men were trained in those procedures, and units had tools allocated specifically for the purpose of digging out buried men as quickly as possible before asphyxiation occurred. The men who were dug out of the earth after being buried alive did not always recover function. They had experienced, in the interval between being buried and being dug out, a period of darkness and immobility, and the knowledge that the earth above them might simply continue to be earth and not become something someone's shovel was penetrating. They had experienced the sensation of breathing the last air available in the small space the earth had left them. Some of them were unconscious when found. Some were found after the air had run out. Some were found after longer periods and were dead. Some were found and were alive and said nothing about what they had experienced for many years or ever. The concussion produced by nearby shell detonations, independent of burial, produced effects that were observed and partially documented. Men who had been near large detonations without being physically wounded in any conventional sense were sometimes found unable to speak, unable to hear, unable to perform voluntary movements. The concussive force of an artillery shell is not simply sound at high volume. It is a pressure wave that passes through the body and through every fluid and tissue within it. The brain is suspended in cerebrospinal fluid within the skull, and a pressure wave of sufficient magnitude causes the brain to move within that fluid, to impact the interior of the skull, to produce damage that is real and measurable in post-mortem examination, but that was largely invisible to the medical assessment of a living man in the field, because the damage did not produce external signs that the assessment instruments available could detect. The medical response to concussion in this war was the same as the medical response to shell shock more broadly, which is to say it was inconsistent, often inadequate, and filtered through an institutional requirement that the men be returned to service as quickly as possible. The rest period prescribed for concussion, to the extent that a standard rest period was prescribed, was insufficient by any standard that subsequent medical understanding would establish. Men returned to the front with brains that had been damaged by blast and were then exposed to further blast. The cumulative effect was not tracked. The institutional framework did not have a category for cumulative blast exposure damage, because acknowledging that category would have required acknowledging that the artillery-saturated environment of the Western Front was producing neurological damage in men at a rate that the medical system could not address. Malingering was the institutional accusation that accompanied any claim of invisible injury. The accusation was deployed most consistently against men who presented symptoms that could not be verified by physical examination, which included the symptoms of most psychological conditions and most neurological conditions, and many internal injuries that did not produce visible external manifestations. The accusation existed as a standing possibility in the assessment of any man whose inability to function could not be confirmed by an X-ray or a visible wound. It was not always applied. Many doctors resisted applying it and fought, within their institutional context, for proper recognition of the conditions they were seeing. But the possibility of the accusation and the consequences that followed the accusation, which could include loss of pay, loss of pension rights, disciplinary action, and in extreme cases court-martial, shaped how men presented their symptoms and what they said about how they were feeling. Men learned to present their symptoms in ways that minimized the possibility of the malingering accusation. They learned to describe physical symptoms rather than psychological ones. They learned which doctors were sympathetic and which were not. They learned to manage their presentation. This is not malingering. This is rational adaptation to an environment in which accurate self-reporting of symptoms could result in punishment. The adaptation meant that the medical data being collected about the war's effects on men was systematically skewed away from the symptoms that were most important to document and toward the symptoms that were safest to report. The conditions in prisoner of war camps varied by country and by the stage of the war, and describing them requires specificity that resists generalization, except to say that the formal provisions of the Hague Conventions, which specified the treatment of prisoners of war in terms of food, shelter, and protection from violence, were applied with inconsistency that increased as the war continued and as the resources of the belligerent states were strained by the demands of fighting a war of this scale. Men who were captured in 1914 and 1915 generally experienced conditions that, while harsh, remained within a recognizable distance of the formal provisions. Men who were captured in 1917 and 1918 experienced conditions that, in some camps and on some fronts, had moved substantially outside them. German prisoners in British and French hands, British and French prisoners in German hands. The conditions were not mirror images of each other, but they shared the common feature of being managed by institutions that had not anticipated holding prisoners at this scale, and that lacked the resources, given the simultaneous demands of fighting the war, to maintain the conditions the formal provisions required. Men died in prisoner of war camps from disease at rates that exceeded what the formal provisions should have permitted. They died from inadequate food and inadequate medical care, and from the specific conditions of particular camps in particular winters. The Red Cross maintained oversight systems and produced reports and made representations to the governments responsible. The governments received the reports and made adjustments at the margin. The conditions improved in some camps and in some periods, and did not improve in others. The experience of being a prisoner was not, in official terms, equivalent to service in the front line. Men who were prisoners of war did not accumulate the formal recognition of service that frontline service produced. When they returned after the war, they often found that the years of their captivity existed in a kind of administrative void. Years that had been lived, that had demanded everything the men had in terms of endurance and survival. But that did not appear in the formal record in a way that produced the recognition or the benefits that frontline service produced. Some spent years attempting to have their captivity recognized in terms that produced practical consequences. Some gave up. Some died before any resolution was reached. The nurses saw everything. This is a statement about evidence and about whose experience entered the historical record and whose did not. Nurses in the First World War worked in conditions that included all of the medical consequences of industrial war, presented at maximum concentration. The clearing stations and base hospitals that sat behind the front lines received men directly from the front lines. Men who had been stabilized enough to transport, but who had not been treated beyond the most basic triage. The nurses who worked in these facilities saw wounds of a kind and scale that civilian medical training had not prepared anyone to see. Limbs destroyed by high explosive. Faces rebuilt by the concussive force of shells that had detonated within inches. Gas burns on skin that had never been designed to encounter the compounds that produced them. Infections that in the pre-antibiotic era progressed with a speed that made the most technically accomplished surgery irrelevant. The nurses wrote about what they saw. Some of them wrote during the war, in letters and diaries. Some wrote after. Some of what they wrote was published. Vera Britton's account is the most widely known, and it is known partly because of the quality of the writing and partly because it addressed directly the experience of the women who served and the cost that service exacted. And it did so without the institutional filter that shaped most official accounts. But the published accounts of the nurses are themselves a fraction of the documentation these women produced. Letters that were not published. Diaries that are in archives and have not been widely read. Records that exist and that constitute an alternate history of the war's medical reality. A history from the perspective of the people who spent the war directly adjacent to the worst that the war produced, who were not given the official language to describe it, and who therefore often found their own. The impact on the nurses was not formally acknowledged during the war or for many years after. The institutions that relied on their labor did not create mechanisms for addressing the psychological consequences of extended exposure to mass medical trauma. The assumption appears to have been that women in nursing roles were either constitutionally suited to the work, in which case no additional support was required, or constitutionally unsuited to it, in which case they would not remain in it. The idea that the work itself was damaging, regardless of constitutional suitability, that what it required of the women doing it exceeded what any human nervous system could manage without cost, was not an idea that the institutional framework was prepared to accommodate. The chaplains were required to be everywhere and to explain everything. This is not a task that language can perform. The regimental chaplain in the First World War was an institutional figure whose role had been defined in the context of wars that operated at a different scale and that did not produce dead in the quantities this one did. He was expected to provide spiritual comfort to dying men, to conduct burial services over bodies that were sometimes incomplete, to maintain morale and the sense that suffering had meaning, and to do all of this while himself being subject to the same conditions, the same artillery, the same gas, the same mud, the same absence of information about when it would end. He was not a combatant, formally, but the distinction between combatant and non-combatant had no practical meaning in a trench under sustained bombardment. Some chaplains adapted by abandoning, in practice if not in formal statement, the theological frameworks they had arrived with and working within a simpler framework that amounted to presence, being with the men, not explaining, not providing answers that the situation made impossible, being there. The ones who are remembered with most affection by the men who knew them seem generally to have been the ones who did this, the ones who attempted to maintain the full apparatus of institutional religion in an environment that was structurally incompatible with its premises were remembered differently. The question of what the men believed about God, about meaning, about the purpose of what was happening to them, is a question that the official record largely evades. The official record contains references to faith, chaplains' reports, references in letters that passed through censorship, statements in memoirs written after the war, but the actual state of the men's belief, the extent to which the experience of the trenches modified or destroyed or transformed the frameworks they had arrived with, is not something that appears clearly in any official document. It appears in fragments, in the private letters, in the unpublished diaries, in the things men said to each other in the dark that were not written down. What is clear is that organized religion as a public institutional presence did not emerge from the war more credible than it had entered it. The men who returned were not, in aggregate, more religious than they had been. The churches that had provided spiritual support for the war effort, that had in many cases encouraged enlistment from their pulpits and had framed the war in terms of divine sanction, found that their authority with the men who had actually fought it was substantially diminished. This was not recorded in any official document. It appeared in attendance records, in the quiet non-participation of veterans in the religious practices that the pre-war world had expected of them. The financial cost of the war was managed through mechanisms that distributed its burden across time in ways that the men who bore the immediate human cost could not anticipate and did not consent to. Britain entered the war as the world's largest creditor nation and emerged from it as a debtor, primarily to the United States. The debt financing of the war, through government bonds, through currency expansion, through foreign borrowing, produced an economic structure that would shape the lives of the men who survived and the children they had, and the society they returned to in ways that were not visible in 1918 but that became visible in the following 2 decades. The economic consequences of the war funding were part of the circumstances that produced the Depression of the 1930s, which produced the social and political conditions that made another war possible. The men who survived the First World War lived long enough, in many cases, to see the children who had been born while they were in the trenches enlisting for the next one. The pensions for the disabled were inadequate by any standard that took seriously the damage the war had produced. Men who had lost limbs received pensions calculated on the basis of assessed earning capacity reduced, which was a framework that had been designed for industrial accidents of the kind a peacetime economy produced, applied to damage of a kind and scale that the framework could not adequately address. Men who had lost their sight received pensions. Men who had lost their hearing received pensions. Men who had lost their capacity to function psychologically, whose damage was real and measurable in the devastation of their lives and relationships and ability to work, received pensions only if their condition could be documented in the terms the pension system required, which was the same documentation problem that the medical system had been unable to solve during the war. The pension appeals system processed cases for decades after the war ended. Men who had left the army in 1918 and 1919 were still in the pension appeals system in the 1930s and in some cases into the 1940s. The system had been designed to be demanding, in the sense that the burden of proof was on the claimant to demonstrate that his condition was service-related, that it had been caused by what the war had done to him, and not by some pre-existing condition or some cause unrelated to service. The demands of this proof were high. Medical records were incomplete because the conditions they documented had often not been recorded in the form the proof required. The men who administered the system were not malicious. They were applying criteria that had been established by institutions that understood the scale of the liability they faced and had created criteria designed to manage that liability. The war memorials were built quickly in the immediate years after the war, and they were built because the communities that built them needed to do something with the loss. They needed a physical location for grief. They needed a form that gathered the names of the men they had known. The memorials were not built by the state, primarily. They were built by communities, by subscription, by the accumulated small donations of people who had known the dead and wanted something to stand in the place of the bodies that were not coming home. The form the memorials took was dignified and regularized. Lists of names, usually alphabetical, cut into stone. Nothing about how the men died. Nothing about the conditions in which they lived. Nothing about the gap between the official account and the physical reality. The names on the memorials are the same men whose files are in the National Archives. The files contain the information that the memorials omit. The files contain the medical records and the disciplinary records, and the pension claims and the letters that were intercepted, and the reports of the officers who commanded the men, and the assessments of the chaplains who saw them at the end. The files and the memorials exist in a precise relationship to each other. The memorials are the public face. The files are everything the public face was built to conceal. Both are accurate. Neither is complete. Together, they constitute the full record of what the institution did and what the institution chose to show. The last men to die in the war died in the final hours of the final day, because the armistice that ended the fighting was scheduled to take effect at 11 o'clock on the morning of the 11th of November 1918, and the operations that were conducted in the hours before 11 o'clock killed men. This is a fact that is precisely documented because the times of death are in the records, and the time of the armistice is in the records, and the comparison of these two sets of data produces a clear picture of men dying after it was known the war was ending, in operations ordered after the armistice had been negotiated, by commanders who made the decision to use the remaining operational hours to advance before the line froze. The reasons for these decisions varied. Some commanders believed the operations would secure better post-war positions. Some believed they had orders to press forward until 11, and they followed those orders. Some appear to have believed that the men should be made to fight until the last possible moment, though the reasoning behind this belief is not clearly documented in any surviving record. 11,000 casualties were suffered on the final morning of the war, between the time the armistice was signed and the time it took effect. In context, this number is not exceptional. It is a number comparable to many other mornings in the war's history. What is exceptional is only that the context is known, that these casualties occurred after the date of ending had been established, that the people who ordered the operations that produced them knew the war was ending. The men who died in those final hours are in the records. Their names are on memorials. The decision that sent them forward on that specific morning, the last morning, is in the records too. The two sets of records exist alongside each other, in the same archives, filed in the same systems, processed by the same institution that processed everything else this war produced. By the time the guns stopped, the major belligerent nations had mobilized approximately 65 million men. Of those, approximately 17 million died, military and civilian. The wounded numbered higher. The men who returned with conditions that would not appear in casualty statistics for years or decades numbered higher still. The institution had processed all of them. It had created records for all of them. It had issued them numbers and classifications and assessments and certificates, and in the appropriate cases, death notifications on forms designed for the purpose, filed in the correct registries, stamped with the correct stamps, signed by the officers with the appropriate authority to sign. The machine had run. The paperwork was complete. The war ended, and the filing continued.